In part C, we have a equals 2 pi rh plus 2 pi r squared, and we want to solve that for r. This is actually the surface area, including the circular end caps of the right circular cylinder that we looked at earlier. You don't need to know that. All we need to do is solve for r. So, okay, what I want you to notice here is that with respect to the unknown r, this is a quadratic equation. And it has both r to the first power in it and r squared in it. And when that happens, you can't solve it by taking roots unless you want to complete the square. So an easier way than completing the square is to use the quadratic formula. So we think of r as the variable and everything else as constant. So let's do this. First of all, just think back to how we apply the quadratic formula. You have to set the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to do that here by subtracting a from both sides, but I'm also going to rearrange it in descending powers of r. So I'm going to put 2 pi r squared in front when I rewrite the thing. So if I do that, I get 2 pi r squared and then plus 2 pi rh. I'm going to rewrite this guy, though. To put it in more familiar terms, I'm going to write it as 2 pi. I'm going to switch the multiplication around here. So 2 pi h times r. And then you'll see why I did that in a second. And then the minus a on the end. And I'm going to put the 0. Remember, it equals something. We subtracted a from both sides, so there's a 0 left over here. But I'm going to put that on the right. Now think about the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula says if we have a times r squared plus b times r plus c, so I'm using r instead of x, and that equals 0, then r is going to equal the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So all we have to do is identify a, b, and c. This a is not the same as this a. Hopefully that's obvious. All we have to do is identify a, b, and c from this equation. So what's a, what's b, what's c? Little a is going to be the coefficient of r squared, which is 2 pi. B is going to be the coefficient of r, which in this equation is 2 pi h. So you have to take that whole thing. B is 2 pi h. And C rather is going to be negative a. You have to include the negative. So C is equal to negative a. Once you've identified a, b, and c, you plug and chug into the quadratic formula. So I'm plugging in, so I'm looking at this equation, I'm plugging in to this formula, and I get the opposite of b. Well, the opposite of b, opposite of 2 pi h, negative 2 pi h. Plus or minus. We'll talk about the plus or minus in a few minutes, whether or not the minus needs to be there. B squared, which is 2 pi h, the whole thing squared, minus 4 times a, this a, times c, which is the opposite of uppercase a. All over 2 times lowercase a, which is 2 times 2 pi, 4 pi. I think we can do that in our heads. Okay, now that's an answer, but we're going to simplify this thing. We're going to write it as r equals, first of all, let's simplify that radicand. So negative 2 pi h doesn't change, plus or minus. I'm going to rewrite 2 pi h squared. Because the operation is multiplication, I can apply this exponent to each factor, the 2, the pi, and the h. And I'm going to go ahead and do that in this case and write it as 4 pi squared h squared. And then there's a minus here makes it makes the operation plus 8 pi times a. all over 4 pi. Okay, now we can factor out something in the Radican. We can factor out a 4 from the 4 and the 8. We could also factor out a pi, but that's not going to help us. So I'm just going to factor out the 4 underneath that Radican. Everything else stays the same outside of that. So negative 2 pi h plus or minus square root. Factoring out the 4 gets us 4 out here. And then pi squared h squared is left over inside the parentheses. Plus, okay, what's left from 8 when you factor out 4? So 2 pi a. All over 4 pi. Now I factored out this 4 right here because I know the square root of 4 is 2, and when the operation is multiplication, you can split up the square root over multiplication. Bring the square root of 4 outside, so you can bring the 2 on the outside like that. Okay, so I'm going to go up here, and in the next step, so that I can simplify the whole fraction, the whole solution here, or the whole formula rather, I'm going to go ahead and factor out this 2 and this 2. And if I do that, I'm left with, what, just negative pi h in this first term. And then plus or minus the square root of pi squared h squared plus 2 pi times a. All that's underneath the root. And then all over 4 times pi. What's going to happen is this 2 is going to divide out with the 2, the factor of 2 from that 4, and so we get it to look a little simpler anyway. It's not a huge deal. And then we're left with negative pi h plus or minus the square root of pi squared h squared plus 2 pi a all over 2 pi. Isn't that lovely? No? Oh, sorry. Okay, one thing we need to talk about is, remember, all the unknowns here are positive. They're at least non-negative. So we don't need this minus here. And we'll take this guy as our answer.